I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Neil Seeman with me tonight. He is a publisher, a writer, and an interdisciplinary academic and a senior fellow at Massey College in the University of Toronto. But he's here tonight because he wants to talk about an issue that he thinks is really important. He wrote a front page column in the National Post on it. Charlie Kirk was an intellectual throwback to a more civilized age. In the tradition of William F. Buckley, Kirk was willing to examine his beliefs and debate his opponents, things that have been lost in the social media era. And Neil Seeman wanted to talk to me about it. Neil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be back and to speak about free speech, something dear to both of our hearts, I know. Thank you.
Why did you write this column?
Impulse. More fundamentally, I felt compelled to write it. I was concerned that there was an indifference and lack of discussion in Canada in particular around this epochal event in America, and I felt an obligation. I felt a reminiscence to my conversations and time at National Review in the early 2000s, and I wanted to remind people of that time. And Charlie Kirk, I don't know Charlie Kirk, I don't know his family, nor did I have any relationship with his Turning Point USA, reminded me of that time when we had civil discourse, when we yanked people out of their digital echo chambers and dialogued openly.
You called it a popcal event. Why?
Charlie, were it not for Charlie Kirk, President Trump would not be in office today. And that's widely understood in America. And so what we had happen in America was the murder of someone instrumental to President Trump's electoral success. And whatever you may think of him or his views, that event was head changing for people across the political spectrum in America. We saw resolution in the House. In America, we saw people across the aisles sort of condemning political violence. There were a wide range of reactions, mostly in the form of a recognition that we had to return to civil discourse. And I think it's real and palpable in my discussions with Americans. And I don't think we in Canada fully recognize what a change it heralds.
So you think that Charlie Kirk represented civil discourse? Some people think that he was a motivator of young men to sort of join right-wing Christian ideological points of view. So was he one or the other or both?
Yeah, he undoubtedly seemed to have served up a return to religion and Christianity in particular. I listened to about 16 hours, of discussion between him and various prominent podcasters. And I didn't hear that so much as I heard a provocateur. Um, but undoubtedly, there were parts of his speech that gave rise to young men sort of, and certainly encouraging young men to question the Democratic left in particular and to join the MAGA movement. But this was something that we saw in 2016 as well. I think Charlie Kirk just sort of emboldened what was already there in the Republican Party. But beyond that, I think he was someone who, as I say, yanked young people in particular, going into hundreds of universities, out of their digital echo chamber and forced them to confront their assumptions. And he would ask questions, and he would often do so with alacrity and, as I say, good cheer. And he would challenge them in the great spirit of William F. Buckley and others.
Tell everyone, if you could, who William F. Buckley was and what the National Review was.
The National Review, it's still around. It's a magazine in the center right. The National Review opposed President Trump, it should be said, and was actually its probably strongest intellectual counter on the right in America. William F. Buckley was an author of umpteen books, a debater, a public debater, really defined what a public intellectual was in the 20th century. Interestingly, he ran for mayor of New York, I think, in 1965, and was certainly the first conservative I know who championed the legalization of marijuana. And I'm of the view that the liberal progression toward the legalization of marijuana would not have happened were it not for William F. Buckley. But beyond that, the magazine was more than a magazine and is still more than a magazine. It's a sort of a bellwether of intellectual questioning, certainly on the right and the center right. It was always a counterweight to sort of its let's just say its provocateurs on the other side, like the Nation magazine.
And you had a personal story that you shared in the column that was about William F. Buckley, and that gave you this connection with Charlie Kirk. Can you tell us? Can you share that story with us?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I was reminded of it. So what had happened? It was 2001, and certainly I was not the center of the evening. Mr. Buckley had over essentially a dinner party where someone in conservative circles was being recruited to be a conservative candidate for the mayor of New York. But he and I guess, were less interested in that than we were in conversing. And I was most interested in his forthcoming book, which was about Elvis Presley. He was very interested in Elvis Presley. I think it was his 18th or 17th book published by Harcourt. And I was intrigued by the process of him getting book blurb reviews. As you know, I'm a book publisher, so I find this very interesting still today. And at the time, he was trying to there was a very famous musician who had given him, a rock musician who had given him a review of his book. And there was a bit of a kind of a reflection on what was going on behind that review. He chose not to use the review.
Do you
And
think
so that was my memory.
do you think William F. Buckley invited other people's points of view?
Well, he certainly did with me. I mean, we disagreed over capital punishment. I mean, we both we both agreed on the end position, but we disagreed on how we arrived there. I recall, and certainly on abortion, points of disagreement. I think he with both those issues, I recall he was open to the moral complexity of them. Um, and the evolution of his thinking on those matters and what issues were relevant. We talked about Hillary Clinton as well. I should say you didn't ask me what musician it was who who gave him the review. The review he didn't use. It was Mick Jagger. So we talked about any number of things, and it was wide ranging, and he was kind of, yes, definitely entertaining of different points of view. This was his life, And I think there was some connection between sort of the approach, let's say, that Buckley had and the approach that Kirk had.
Was he open to other points of view, or did he just want to persuade the other point of view why and how they were wrong?
No, definitely with me, he was open to different points of view. I mean, he was intrigued by me being a Canadian. I mean, at the time, I think I was either the first or one of maybe only two Canadians who had been in the orbit of National Review. So he's intrigued by liberalism and its march in Canada. Uh, so I think he would definitely strike me as someone who's sort of open-minded to different points of view. Now, I should say that the the aftermath of Charlie Kirk reminded me that 30 years ago, being open to different points of view and sort of facing down the strongest of your opponent's arguments was very much de rigueur within intellectual combat. It was so that's certainly not unique to Buckley at all. I was a regular guest on Avi Lewis's CBC Cross Currents show, I remember, and we always had good repartee. The same was true on Michael Corrin's show, I recall. It was a different time. I mean, we all laughed. We weren't in the same hardened positions, tribalism that we are today, I feel.
Was Charlie Kirk an ideologue?
Yes, he was an ideologue in the sense that he was moored by conviction. He was moored by conviction, and ideologues are fine. They're perfectly fine. It's okay to be moored by conviction, and there's certainly a range of issues with which I disagree vehemently with Charlie Kirk on, certainly on the gun rights and a range of other matters. Um, but he was an ideologue who, at the center of that, understood, I think, well, one, and he was very clear in this in his exchanges on podcasts, is that, his personal views needed to be separated from Turning Point USA's views first. And secondly, he was an ideologue who understood how important it was to face down the weakest of your claims.
Was he open to other points of view, or did he just want to persuade people of the rightness of his point of view?
Yeah, I think he was more the latter. I think, I don't, obviously I didn't know him in a personal capacity, but he was definitely trying to press a point of view, prosecute an argument. I think he felt clearly based on his actions that uh, that was done with greater rigor. If you engaged your opponents and you entered into a kind of cage fight on a liberal campus and invited your opponents to sort of challenge you on stage.
A cage fight. That's an interesting analogy to use. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back. And I'm going to ask our guest a little bit more about civil discourse versus where he fears we are today. Because I think he's right to be concerned about that. And I think it's something that we've all got to pay attention to. I'm also going to ask him a little bit about why Charlie Kirk and his ideas were so resonated with young men so much, and is that a an issue, a trend that we have to be aware of? And I'm also going to ask him to tell us a little bit of himself. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with our guest, Neil Seeman. Stay with us. Back in two. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got Neil Seeman with us today. He's written a really interesting front-page National Post column about Charlie Kirk and his assassination and civil discourse and some recollections he had to William F. Buckley and the National Review. And I think, Neil, your argument is that civil discourse is something that is healthy for our society. Before I go back and ask you a couple of questions, I want to ask you about you. The individual that introduced us said that you were the smartest person she had met. Why are you the smartest person? What's your background, sir? Tell us all a little bit about yourself.
Well, that obviously means that that person who introduced us may not know enough people, but I'll certainly be happy to tell you a bit about my background. So I'm the son of two scientists. My mother was a women's health mental researcher specializing in estrogens in the brain and how they affected women's mental health. My father was the famous dopamine scientist who understood how dopamine receptors in the brain affect drug chemicals that lead one down the path of severe mental illness. I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. I am a lifelong student. I love learning from people across generations, from people across disciplines. I think I'm connected to at least six faculties in terms of, disciplines and discourse at the university. And I like stretching my mind. So maybe that doesn't answer your friend's question, but it certainly answers the question why I'm too interested in too many things.
There's a fascinating book that I'm not sure if you've ever heard of called, I think it was The Geography of Genius. And it went through history where some of the most interesting intellectual developments ever took place. And they were in geographies where diverse cultures interacted. And they talked about Edinburgh, Scotland, where there were famously this gentlemen's clubs where people would get together and argue, but then they'd have a beer together. And the point was that you debated like crazy, but then you didn't hate the person. You felt like after the argument was done, you could have a drink with them. They talked about Vienna, where Jews and Gentiles would get together and develop incredible symphonies and great works of on mental health and psychiatry and things like that. They talked about some of the the Fertile Crescent, where cultures from different parts of the world, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, would mix and trade, and cultures would mix, and menus would mix, and recipes would mix, and ingredients would mix, and ideas would mix. And there's this whole sort of theory that they put forward that the mixing of people and the mixing of ideas was the secret to success. So much so that they even used the terminology idea sex, that ideas needed to meet and to mutate and to reproduce and to have fun together. And that's how ideas became better ideas. So I got to ask you, is civil discourse healthy for a society or frankly critical for a society?
Oh, it's essential. It's the backbone, and yeah, we all agree. I mean, at least on paper. I mean, it's foundational to Canadian society. It's in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we encourage free speech. It's really bred in the bone of several of our recent prime ministers. One of whom I knew quite well, Stephen Harper. Free speech, civil discourse. And and yes, I mean we can't possibly transplant ideas across disciplines, across faiths, across nations, unless we speak with one another. And certainly we need to speak with one another in live settings, or certainly outside of social media. Once you speak with people of opposable minds, you learn that we're always a lot more alike than different, except for certain individuals in the pantheon of evil. We can list them here tonight if you wish. Most of us have good and wish to sort of engage in friendly debate on really complex dynamic issues. I think that there are a lot of culpable parties, and we're all culpable in the process of sort of melting away the middle and forcing people to extremes. And there's been a number of developments over the last 20 years that have, I think, accelerated that polarization. It's not just President Trump. Yes, he does use his megaphone in a way that can polarize, but there are other factors in society that have led us to, let's just say, become atomistic and separate ourselves from one another.
I'd be interested in hearing what you think some of those other factors are. I think it was 2008 or 2009. I remember a big debate between I think it was Michael Ignatieff and Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper was the prime minister at the time. Michael Ignatieff was, I believe, leader of the official opposition at the time. And they had a big debate. And then at the end, they said something to the effect of, but in Canada, when we debate, we're competitors, we're not enemies. And I thought that was a good quote. Um, Too often today, I think we're enemies when there's discussions and debates, and frankly, enemies that don't even hear the other party. So, what are these factors that you've suggested that have changed things such that we're so polarized that we're living in our echo chambers that we're not even listening to opposing points of view?
It's interesting that you raised both Michael and Stephen, two wonderful people I know. I mean, interestingly, you know, Michael, a great champion of the human rights and free speech. He once shared with me because I asked him this very question, and he said, there was a time when he'd be out on the campaign physically, and he'd only have one or two people sort of criticize him or heckle him, but you wouldn't know that if you were on social media, right? Um, and certainly, social media and the smartphone and the ease with which we can, with no consequence, sort of just say the most awful things about one another. This sort of spirited up, right? I mean, in 2007, that's when Twitter really took off. And then things magnified. Uh, the one thing that has happened that we don't talk about enough is discourse amid COVID and how the COVID sort of positioning. And I'm a public health person, very much, supportive of uh, uh, sort of pharmaceutical interventions and things that members of the trucker convoy sort of argued against. But that lack of the messy middle and the sort of that period of time, that sort of 4 years where it became normal to take sort of feet in the ground and just sort of close your ears to other people. I think that really hardened us, and so that's why I feel this Charlie Kirk moment is something new because I think people are starting to remember there was a time, there was a time before COVID, there was a time before social media, and all these aggravating factors when you could engage in a kind of friendly democracy and as you say, have a beer afterwards, and actually sort of bend your mind in a little way. So I think those are two factors. Now, there's others, but we also have, I think, within a younger generation, and I saw this sort of after the Charlie Kirk murder, sort of a lack of understanding around how you engage with tragic events. We had the same situation after the tragic shooting of the insurance executive in New York, right? Like there's sort of this disconnect, and I don't like blaming everything on social media, but there is a comfort or a strange comfort that some members of the younger generation like to participate in, where you just retreat into this digital echo chamber and say, "Oh, yes, assassination of all types is wrong, but Charlie Kirk is, and everyone around him is an XYZ, and just sort of the most awful things, just to completely denigrate, in America's case, wide swaths of the population."
So I wonder about our electoral system, and whether that's part of the problem, because you think about the time periods where there's been a big change in government. It has been rare, and it's been when there was something that caused a substantial change in turnout. And I'm thinking about two in particular. The statistics I think show that if there weren't a whole bunch of new people that came out in the first election of Barack Obama would not have won, according to all the statistics. It was primarily people of color that came out in dramatically greater amounts than had happened before. That was the reason why Barack Obama got elected. And then that turnout dissipated during the midterms and dissipated even more over the next two election cycles, such that that turnout didn't exist when Hillary Clinton was the candidate, and one of the reasons why she wasn't elected. Similarly, when Justin Trudeau was first elected, I think in 2015, there was a significant increase in turnout, primarily with young people and people of color. And some people think the young people showed up because of his policy on marijuana. They wanted legalization, going back to your William F. Buckley argument. But the turnout then went down. And the statistics show that if the turnout was the same as it had been in the prior election, Stephen Harper would have won another government. And so it was turnout changes. But in almost every other election, turnout went down. And with lower turnout, you're not trying to persuade. All you're trying to do is identify and get out your vote. And, I've been involved in political parties, and one of my frustrations is that those campaign organizers spend all your time telling you, go out, identify your vote, and then get it out. And if you've identified, based on history or based on your conversation, someone that is voting the other way, don't even knock on their door. Don't rouse them to action. Don't encourage them to come out. So that we don't have persuasion, all we have is identify and get out the vote. We've lost
Brian,
this.
Brian, that is fascinating. So your suggestion, your insight, and it makes sense, is that big data analytics, especially the more granular you get at the political campaign level, actually incentivizes you to just ignore the art of persuasion, political persuasion, and can have a downstream effect in terms of lack of engagement and voter turnout, if I understand what you're saying correctly. And it kind of resonates with my life too. I only canvassed a couple times, once in '95, and I really enjoyed going out on the hustings and knocking on doors in territory that was not friendly to my candidate. I enjoyed it. And you know what? I there were no doors slammed on me whatsoever. I mean, and more recently, we had a by-election near me, similar. I mean, so when you actually do engage, you don't have hostile engagement. But that's a really interesting point. Big data analytics. And yeah, when I think back to the first campaign that at least big campaign that championed big data analytics, I believe it was the Obama campaign, and then subsequent campaigns, both Trump in 2016, of course, and Trump 2020, and then more recently in Canada. They all like to boast about the sophistication of their big data analytics. So that's a really interesting and trenchant insight. Makes sense.
Well, in Australia, as you may know, has compulsory voting. And they don't get 100%, but they get like over 97% turnout. And the interesting thing there is persuasion has to come back. And I think they have more civil discourse. At least that's what I understand. And it's because if identify and get out the vote is useless because people are going to go vote, then the key is actually persuading people to vote your policies. So you got to spend time. And so I think that, frankly, we should be thinking about that. I'm going to take a
Yeah.
break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you about motivating young people, young men particularly, and is that something that Charlie Kirk has taught us? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with our guest Neil Seeman talking about freedom of speech and Charlie Kirk. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Radio Hour. I've got Neil Seeman with us tonight. He is, a polyglot. You're involved in everything, and you're one of these Renaissance men that I'm really very impressed with. What's your main gig? Is it teaching at Monk, or is it publishing books, or do you have a main gig because you're so involved in so
Actually,
many gigs?
I but with my colleague, I had to identify everything I'm doing. So 40% of my time is spent on publishing my books, about 15-20% at the university where I'm a professor in public health, health policy, health systems. But I'm also co-teaching a computer science course this year. And then, of course, I write and speak with interesting people like you.
And you've published this really interesting column in the National Post about Charlie Kirk and his assassination, and your issues about civil discourse and comparisons with the National Review and William F. Buckley. I want to change topics sort of for a while. I've had a couple of shows recently on the alienation of young men and the attraction young men have had, it would appear, both in Canada and the United States, to the right, and to Christianity and to Charlie Kirk. And even Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, Democrat, has been talking about how young men are in crisis, and they have found this sort of challenge of identity and meaning in life, and the sort of the probably incorrect, but the sort of generalization and typification of them is, these single young men living in their mother's basements playing video games, unable to get a date, unable to get married, difficulty finding a job, et cetera, et cetera. And they're frustrated. They're frustrated with wokeism. They're frustrated with women's liberation. They're frustrated with women having more positions in post-secondary education than men today, and the statistics are kind of glaring that in law school and in medical school, female representation and graduation has gone up dramatically. Whether that's good or bad, people can decide. But it would appear that the fact that a majority of those positions were held by males historically is no longer true, and yet at the same time, not all, but a significant portion have found themselves very attracted to right-wing policies, to Christianity, and to Charlie Kirk, and to podcasts. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to take in. I mean, I think youth, period, are disconnected and looking for meaning. And Charlie Kirk stands out as someone who is a person of God and belief and faith. And when you have a disconnect in your life, you're often intrigued, at least, by somebody with an anchor and is persuading you to join that anchor. Um, I think it's important to recognize that the MAGA movement is just that. It's not conservatism as I certainly used to understand it, nor is it neoconservatism as I used to understand it, classical liberalism, so-called mugged by reality and resistance to the state, certainly not libertarianism. It's a kind of populism and what some people refer to as kind of defensive nationalism, right? So it's that defensive nationalism, I think, that's feeding into these young men's minds, and undoubtedly from the data, increasingly they're drifting into the MAGA movement, and they have since 2015, 2016. I mean, largely because they felt left out, and they weren't being covered by the national media in America. They were ignored. Suffering at great higher rates of addiction and alienation. And so I think there is a recognition that young men, feel rootless, but at the same time, I think feeling ignored is probably a better way of saying it. So I certainly know that it's not just Charlie Kirk, as you say. You refer to podcasts. I think it's finding voice, finding discourse in areas where they wouldn't either, otherwise find it. I think it's great that we all we're all, everyone, should be very pleased with the rights revolution in Canada and what it's yielded in terms of women being, as you say, increasingly perhaps overrepresented in academic fields. But then it sort of tails off, right? Because they don't often sort of jump up the academic ladder at the same pace as men as they go through it. But those important detail statistics are often removed from the debate. But there is something to that. I don't know the full diagnostic as to why, but I think there's something to do with a secular society and being trapped in gaming addiction, which is very troubling among young men, and gambling addiction, which is very troubling among young men. These are serious addictions, and all of it bubbles together and can often motivate. Let's just say someone, and I don't want to speculate as to his condition precisely, but someone of the nature of the assassin of Charlie Kirk into a rabbit hole of sort of online addiction and discourse with sort of the ne'er-do-wells in the darkest corners of the web.
The Republican Party in the last election seems to have benefited from this trend, and the Conservative Party in Canada seems to as well. That one of the demographics that were the biggest changes from a historical voting pattern were young men voting right wing. What does that say?
Yeah, I do think it's different in Canada, though, Brian. I mean, when we look at the splits on the right in Canada, to my understanding from the data is that what's inspiring younger men to lean right in Canada is economic and sort of a hunger for economic revival in this country. Whereas I think you're right, in America, it's sort of more of a tug on the sort of the populist appeal and a kind of sense of anger, right? Picking up on that sort of angry white man phenomenon. Now, there may well be that here in Canada. I don't want to suggest that it's not here, but I don't see it in the data dominantly.
One of the other trends, and this is maybe a self-serving question, but was that people described this last election in the United States as the podcast election. I think that the Obama election that you talked about being driven by data was also called the Facebook election. That Facebook was a big motivator of vote and voting intention and persuasion, I guess, during that election. This last election, lots of people described as the podcast election. Because people could tune in with a long form interview on Joe Rogan and they got the sense they really understood the person and got to know who they were and what their policies were. And that the politicians that, were only go to traditional media and get a 5 or, lucky if they were 5-minute interview, really lost that opportunity. And yet that's where most of our media is small little snippets. What do you think that says about media and persuasion and civil discourse that when given the opportunity to watch a long form interview with someone who they really want to get to know, some people take advantage of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reminded of the great mind Marshall McLuhan, right? Who would intone that you need to lean into the medium being the message, right? So those who fight against it don't just can't harness it. And so who knows, maybe the next election is going to be the AI election. So yeah, in hindsight, you're right. It was the podcast election. I think I think what it says is in part what I believe, and this is I think what makes podcasting thrive, is the unfiltered nature and the authentic nature of these conversations, right? I think people are hungry for authentic discourse, both on the left and the right. They don't want these sort of performative, filtered, social media dialogues. So I think that has something to do with it. But I can't explain it further than that, Brian. But I invite you to compliment my insights.
We talking primarily about freedom of speech in the last last administration. maybe the last couple of administrations, other than Donald Trump, there was this attitude about society becoming too woke, and that there was cancel culture. And if you didn't have the exact right point of view, you were canceled, and you lost your job, you lost your position in academia, you were canceled, and you had to be woke. And now we have this, what some people are describing as authoritarianism, where if you don't have a point of view, you're sued, or you lose your job. Is this the same on the right as it was on the left?
Yes. So cancel culture is sort of clearly appealing to some within the fringes of MAGA culture, pockets of MAGA culture, just as it is in on the sort of the Ocasio-Cortez left. I mean, we and this is why, right? This is why people stand up against that stand up in favor of free speech. Some people in favor of absolutist free speech, such that people can be given a platform and should not be sanctioned, except in extreme cases for saying things that may offend. So yes, it has become, and we saw this with the Jimmy Kimmel matter. This is the best sort of example of this, just in response, I guess, to the reaction to the Charlie Kirk assassination. So yes, it's a temptation on both sides, right? So
Are both wrong?
the details really matter. But both are wrong, right? But both are wrong. Yes.
In Canada right
The
now, we're debating a hate speech bill. And some people are saying
Yeah.
that's right. We should make sure that there isn't hate speech. And other people saying that's an infringement of free speech. What do you think?
Yeah, I've always been against against the hate speech, historically Section 319 of the Criminal Code and hate speech laws. I saw it, firsthand. I was sort of almost a victim of an innocent victim of hate speech law in Canada in early 2000s. I'd written an article about this sort of interesting, unusual trend they called masculinism, which were men and some academics sort of advocating for certain rights of men with respect to their children after divorce, and it was given this unusual name, masculinism. And this was written up by a Status of Women branch. It was posted online, and all the people written up in the article, including me, the author of the article, were documented on a government website. And there was the suggestion that hate speech laws be applied to us. So this takes us now. This was taken down by the government of Canada after I made a big stink of it. It was kind of embarrassing, but it to them. But the point of it is that it just shows the ease with which these laws can be abused, and that's what worries me and about these hate speech laws. And I also feel that the intent behind them, while good, can be addressed through existing legal structures, right? And so I think that to the extent that it's needed, it can be embedded in other elements of the law. Or sorry, to the extent that the intent behind them is needed to be addressed, I think we can address them through other elements of the law.
We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. I'm going to ask our guest, so what do we do to ensure that we've got free speech, that we've got civil discourse, that we've got people living in community rather than in an echo chamber? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Fascinating conversation tonight with Neil Seeman, who has written a really interesting column in the National Post about Charlie Kirk's assassination, about William F. Buckley, about civil discourse. And so I got to ask you, sir, if we don't have enough of in our society today, if we are living in these echo chambers, if we're not listening to one another, if we're not trying to persuade, what do we do? How do we solve this problem?
We start young. in the high schools or younger. We encourage, it really should be part of the curriculum that you need to engage in debate such that you are as familiar with your opponent's argument as they are, and you need to articulate that, and you need to be graded on that. That has to be embedded into the school system such that we recognize that understanding one's opponent's point of view is just as important as understanding your own and can only make your own stronger. That's one piece of the puzzle. And I think the other piece of the puzzle is getting people to talk about solutions as we're doing right now, Brian.
I think that in those Oxford, Cambridge universities of yesteryear, they had a course called rhetoric, and you actually had to learn how to make a good speech, and you had to make a good debate. And so I think that that's one of the solutions as well. You're right. I also think, I really honestly think that we've got to change our electoral system to have compulsory voting. Everyone should go out to vote, and I think if we had everyone or almost everyone voting, we would change our whole system dramatically, because it's that 30% or 40% of the people that really deserve their voice and would change things dramatically if we forced them to use their voice and make decisions with it. And that would change every political party on every single issue to think a lot more about persuasion. I think too often in politics, in culture, in life, you want to find your supporters, and you only want to get 50.1% of them because that's victory. When really what we should be trying to do is to try to create consensus, unanimity, and new converts, and grow our supporter base and make it a movement, hopefully. And I wish that we did that, and I wish that we therefore had more Charlie Kirks that of all different types of attitudes that would go out to different universities and college campuses and high schools and debate. I also think, frankly, that if we lowered the voting age to 16, every politician would show up at high schools to debate. And if you voted once before you left high school on average, and that would be half of the people that would vote on average once, and given all the different elections, maybe for sure all the people would vote at least once, I think you'd have a tendency to vote more often. So that's
Yeah,
two
hooray,
ideas.
Brian. I'm with you on the 16. Yeah, absolutely. We got to start younger. Yeah, no, great point.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I love the opportunity to talk to really smart, opinionated people like Neil Seeman. I get that opportunity every day, Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 a.m. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos get put up on my website, briancrombie.com, on my YouTube channel, on podcast servers, on social media, on LinkedIn, everywhere. As soon as the radio show goes to air, so you can hopefully hear me sometime. Thanks for joining. Good night.